It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, Chapter 31. As the open prison van approached the concentration camp at Trianon, the last light of afternoon caressed the thick birch and maples and poplars up the pyramid of Mount Faithful. But the grayness swiftly climbed the slope, and all the valley was left in cold shadow. In his seat, the sick Doremus drooped again in listlessness. The prim Georgian buildings of the girls' school, which had been turned into a concentration camp at Trianon, 9 miles north of Fort Beulah, had been worse used than Dartmouth, where the whole buildings were reserved for the luxuries of the corpos and their female cousins, all very snotty and parvenu. The Trianon school seemed to have been gouged by a flood. Marble doorsteps had been taken away. One of them now graced the residence of the wife of the superintendent, Mrs. Cowlick, a woman fat, irate, jeweled, religious, and given to announcing that all opponents of the chief were communists and ought to be shot offhand. Windows were smashed. Hurrah for the chief had been chalked on brick walls, and other chalked words, each of 4 letters, had been rubbed out, not very thoroughly. The lawns and hollyhock beds were a mess of weeds. The building stood on 3 sides of a square. The 4th side and the gaps between the buildings were closed with unpainted pine fences topped with strands of barbed wire. Every room except the office of the Captain Cowlick, superintendent. He was as near nothing at all as any man can be who has attained such honors as being a captain in the quartermaster corps at the head of a prison, was smeared with filth. His office was merely dreary and scented with whiskey, not like the other rooms, with ammonia. Cowlick was not too ill-natured. He wished that the camp guards, all MMs, would not treat the prisoners viciously, except when they tried to escape. But he was a mild man, much too mild to hurt the feelings of the MMs, and perhaps set up inhibitions in their psyches by interfering with their methods of discipline. The poor fellows probably meant well when they lashed noisy inmates for insisting they had committed no crime. And the good Cowlick saved Doremus's life for a while. Let him lie for a month in the stuffy hospital and have actual beef in his daily beef stew. The prison doctor, decayed old drunkard who had had his medical training in the late 80s and who had been somewhat close to trouble in civil life for having performed too many abortions, was also good-natured enough when sober, and at last he permitted Doremus to have Dr. Marcus Olmsted in from Fort Beulah, and for the first time in 4 weeks, Doremus had news, any news whatsoever, of the world beyond the prison. Where in normal life it would have been agony to wait for 1 hour to know what might be happening to his friends, his family, now for 1 month he had not known whether they were alive or dead. Dr. Olmsted, as guilty as Doremus himself of what the corpos called treason, dared speak to him only a moment, because the prison doctor stayed in the hospital ward all the while, drooling over whip-scared patients and daubing iodine more or less near their wounds. Olmsted sat on the edge of his cot with its foul blankets, unwashed for months, and muttered rapidly. "Quick! Listen, don't talk. Mrs. Jessup and your 2 girls are all right. They're scared, but no signs of their being arrested. Here Lorenda Pike is all right. Your grandson, David, looks fine, though I'm afraid he'll grow up a corpo, like all the youngsters. Buck Titus is alive at another concentration camp, the one near Woodstock. Our NU cell at Fort Beulah is doing what it can. No publishing, but we forward information and get a lot from Julian Falk. Great joke. He's been promoted, MM squad leader now. Mary and Sissy and Father Père-Fils keep distributing pamphlets from Boston. They help the Quinn boy, my driver, and me to forward the refugees to Canada. Yes, we carry on. About like an oxygen tent for a patient that's dying of pneumonia. It hurts to see you looking like a ghost, Doremus, but you'll pull through. You've got pretty good nerves for a little cuss. That aged-in-the-keg prison doctor's looking this way. Bye." He was not permitted to see Dr. Olmsted again, but it was probably Olmsted's influence that got him. When he was dismissed from the hospital, still shaky but well enough to stumble about, a vastly desirable job as a sweeper of cells and corridors, cleaner of lavatories and scrubber of toilets instead of working in the woods gang up Mount Faithful, or old men who sank under the weight of logs were said to be hammered to death by guards under the sadistic Ensign Stoit when Captain Cowlick wasn't looking. It was better, too, than the undesirable idleness of being disciplined in the doghouse where you lay naked in darkness and where bad cases were reformed by being kept awake for 48 or even 96 hours. Doremus was a conscientious toilet cleaner. He didn't like the work very much, but he had pride in being able to scrub as skillfully as any professional pearl diver in a Greek lunchroom, and satisfaction in lessening a little the wretchedness of his imprisoned comrades by giving them clean floors. For he told himself they were his comrades. He saw that he, who had thought himself as a capitalist because he could hire and fire and because theoretically he owned his own business, had been as helpless as the most itinerant janitor once it seemed worthwhile to the big business which corporism represented to get rid of him. Yet he still told himself stoutly that he did not believe in a dictatorship of the proletariat any more than he believed in a dictatorship of the bankers and utility owners. He still insisted that any doctor or preacher, though economically he might be as insecure as the humblest of his flock, who did not feel that he was a little better than they and privileged to enjoy working a little harder, was a rotten doctor or preacher without grace. He felt that he himself had been a better and more honorable reporter than Doc Itchett, and a thundering sight better of student of politics than most of his shopkeeper and farmer and factory worker readers. Yet bourgeois pride was so gone out of him that he was flattered, a little thrilled, when he was universally called Doremus and not Mr. Jessup, by farmer and workman and truck driver and plain hobo. When they thought enough of his courage under beating and his good temper under being crowded with the others in a narrow cell to regard him as almost as good as their own virile selves. Karl Pascal mocked him. "I told you so, Doremus. You'll be a communist yet." "Yeah, maybe I will, Karl, after you communists kick out all your false prophets and bellyachers and power drunkards and all your press agents for the Moscow subway." "Well, all right. Why don't you join Max Eastman? I hear he's escaped to Mexico and a whole big pure Trotskyite Communist Party of the 17 members there." 17? Too many. What I want is mass action by just one member alone on a hilltop. I'm a great optimist, Karl. I still hope America may someday rise to the standards of Kit Carson. As sweeper and scrubber, Doremus had unusual chances for gossip with other prisoners. He chuckled when he thought of how many his fellow criminals were acquaintances. Karl Pascal, Henry Veeder, his own cousin, Louis Rottenstern, who looked now like a corpse, unforgettably wounded in his old pride of having become a real American. Clarence Little, the jeweler, who was dying of consumption, Ben Tripper, who had been the jolliest workman in Medarie Coal's gristmill, Professor Victor Loveland of the defunct Isaiah College, and Raymond Pridewell, that old Tory who was still so contemptuous of flattery, so clean amid dirt, so hawk-eyed, that the guards were uncomfortable when they beat him. Pascal, the communist, Pridewell, the squirearchy Republican, and Henry Veeder, who had never cared a hang about politics and who had recovered from the first shocks of imprisonment, these three had become inmates because they had more arrogance of utter courage than anyone else in the prison. For home, Doremus shared with 5 other men a cell 12 feet by 10 and 8 feet high, which a finishing school girl had once considered outrageously confined for one lone young woman. Here they slept in 2 tiers of 3 bunks each. Here they ate, washed, played cards, read, and enjoyed the leisurely contemplation which, as Captain Cowlick preached to them every Sunday morning, was to reform their black souls and turn them into loyal corpos. None of them, certainly not Doremus, complained much. They got used to sleeping in a jelly of tobacco smoke and human stench, to eating stews that always left them nervously hungry, to having no more dignity or freedom than monkeys in a cage as a man gets used to the indignity of having to endure cancer. Only it left in them a murderous hatred of their oppressors, so that they, men of peace, all of them, would gladly have hanged every corpo, mild or vicious. Dreamus understood John Brown much better. His cellmates were Carl Pascal, Henry Veeder, and three men whom he had not known: a Boston architect, a farmhand, and a dope fiend who had once kept questionable restaurants. They had a good talk, especially from the dope fiend, who placidly defended crime in a world where the only real crime had been poverty. The worst torture to Doremus, aside from the agony of actual floggings, was the waiting. The waiting. It became a distinct, tangible thing as an individual and real as bread or water. How long would he be in? How long would he be in? Night and day, asleep and waking, he worried it, and by his bunk saw waiting the figure of waiting, a gray, foul ghost. It was like waiting in a filthy station for a late train, not for hours, but for months. Would Swan amuse himself by having Doremus taken out and shot? He could not care much now. He could not picture it, any more than he could picture kissing Lorinda, walking through the woods with Buck, playing with David in Foolish, or anything less sensual than the ever-derisive visions of roast beef with gravy, of a hot bath, last and richest of all luxuries, where the only way of washing, except for a fortnightly shower, was with a dirty shirt dipped in one basin of cold water for 6 men. Besides waiting, one other ghost hung about them, the notion of escaping. It was of that far more than of the beastliness and idiocy of the corpos, that they whispered in the cell at night, when to escape, how to escape, to sneak off through the bushes when they were out with a woods gang, by some magic to cut through the bars on their cell window and drop out blessedly, not seen by the patrols, to manage to hang on underneath one of the prison trucks and be driven away, a childish fantasy. They longed for escape as hysterically and as often as a politician longs for votes, but they had to discuss it cautiously, for there were stool pigeons all over the prison. This was hard for Doremus to believe. He could not understand a man's betraying his companions, and he did not believe it till 2 months after Doremus had gone to the concentration camp. Clarence Little betrayed to the guards Henry Veeder's plan to escape in a hay wagon. Henry was properly dealt with. Little was released. And Doremus, it may be, suffered over it nearly as much as either of them, sturdily though he tried to argue that Little had tuberculosis, and that the often beatings had bled out his soul. Each prisoner was permitted one visitor a fortnight, and, in sequence, Doremus saw Emma, Mary, Sissy, and David. But always an MM was standing 2 feet away, listening, and Doremus had from them nothing more than a fluttering. "We're all fine. We hear Buck is all right. We hear Lorinda's doing fine in her new 2-room. Philip writes he's all right." And once came Philip himself, his pompous son, more pompous than ever now as a corpo judge, and very hurt about his father's inane radicalism. Considerably more hurt when Doremus tartly observed that he would much rather have had the dog Foolish for visitor. And there were letters, all censored, worse than useless to a man who had gotten so glad to hear the living voices of his friends. In the long run, these frustrate visits, these empty letters, made his waiting the more dismal, because they suggested that perhaps he was wrong in his nightly visions. Perhaps the world outside was not so loving and eager and adventurous as he remembered it, but only dreary as his cell. He had little known Carl Pascal, yet now the argumentative Marxian was his nearest friend, his one amusing consolation. Carl could and did prove that the trouble with the leaky valves, sour cow pastures, the teaching of calculus, and all the novels was their failure to be guided by the writings of Lenin. In his new friendship, Doremus was old-maidishly agitated lest Carl be taken out and shot, the recognition usually given to communists. He discovered that he need not worry. Carl had been in jail before. He was the trained agitator for whom Doremus had longed in New Underground days. He had ferreted out so many scandals about the financial and sexual shenanigans of every one of the guards that they were afraid that even while he was being shot, he might tattle to the firing squad. They were much more anxious for his good opinion than for that of Captain Cowlick, and they timidly brought him little presents of chewing tobacco and Canadian newspapers, as though they were schoolchildren honeying up to the teacher. When Eris Dilly was transferred from night patrols in Fort Beulah to the position of guard at Trianon, a reward for having given Shad Ledoux certain information about R.C. Crowley, which cost that banker hundreds of dollars, Eris, that slinker, that able snooper, jumped at the sight of Carl and began to look pious and kind. He had known Carl before. Despite the presence of Stoit, ensign of the guards, an ex-cashier who had once enjoyed shooting dogs and who now, in blessed escape of corpoism, enjoyed lashing human beings. The camp at Trianon was not so cruel as the district prison at Hanover. But from the dirty windows of his cell, Dreamus saw horrors enough. One mid-morning, a radiant September morning, with the air already savoring the peace of autumn, he saw the firing squad marching out his cousin Henry Veeder, who had recently tried to escape. Henry had been a granite monolith of a man. He had walked like a soldier. He had in his cell been proud of shaving every morning, as once he had done, with a tin basin of water heated up on the stove in the kitchen of his old white house up on Mount Terror. Now he stooped, and toward death he walked with dragging feet. His face of a Roman senator was smeared from the cow dung into which they had flung him for his last slumber. As they tramped out through the quadrangle gate, Ensign Stoit, commanding the squad, halted Henry, laughed at him, and calmly kicked him in the groin. They lifted him up. 3 minutes later, Dreamus heard a ripple of shots. 3 minutes after that, the squad came back bearing on an old door a twisted clay figure with vacant open eyes. Then Dreamus cried aloud. As the bearers slanted the stretcher, the figure rolled to the ground. But one thing worse he was to see through that accursed window. The guards drove in as new prisoners, Julian Falk, in torn uniform, and Julian's grandfather, so fragile, so silvery, so bewildered and terrified in his muddied clericals. He saw them kicked across the quadrangle into a building once devoted to instruction in dancing and the more delicate airs for the piano, devoted now to the torture room and the solitary cells. Not for 2 weeks, 2 weeks of waiting that was like ceaseless ache, did he have a chance at exercise hour to speak for a moment to Julian, who muttered, "They caught me writing some inside dope about M.M. Kraft. It was to have gone to Sissy. Thank God nothing on it to show who it was for." Julian had passed on. But Doremus had had time to see that his eyes were hopeless, and that his neat, smallish, clerical face was blue-black with bruises. The administration, or so Doremus guessed, decided that Julian, the first spy among the MMs who had been caught in the Fort Beulah region, was too good a subject of sport to be wastefully shot at once. He should be kept for an example. Often Doremus saw the guards kick him across the quadrangle to the whipping room, and imagined that he could hear Julian's shrieks afterward. He wasn't even kept in a punishment cell, but in an open barred den on an ordinary corridor, so that passing inmates could peep in and see him welts across his naked back, huddled on the floor, whimpering like a beaten dog. And Doremus had sight of Julian's grandfather sneaking across the quadrangle, stealing a soggy hunk of bread from a garbage can and fiercely chewing at it. All through September, Doremus worried lest Sissy, with Julian now gone from Fort Beulah, be raped by Shad Ledoux. Shad would leer the while and gloat over his ascent from hired man to irresistible master. Despite his anguish over the Falks and Henry Veeder and every uncouthest comrade in prison, Doremus was almost recovered from his beatings by late September. He began delightfully to believe that he would live for another 10 years, was slightly ashamed of his delight in the presence of so much agony, but he felt like a young man, and straightway Ensign Stoit was there to And straightaway Ensign Stoit was there. 2 or 3 o'clock at night, it must have been, yanking Dreamus out of his bunk, pulling him to his feet, knocking him down again with so violent a crack in his mouth that Dreamus instantly sank again into all his trembling fear, all his inhuman groveling. "Mr. Jessup, we have information that you were connected with squad leader Julian Falk's treachery. He has, so well, to be frank, he's broken down and confessed. Now, you yourself are in no danger whatever of further punishment, if you would just help us. But we really must make a warning of young Mr. Falk, and so if you will tell us all you know about the boy's shocking infidelity to the colors, we shall hold it in your favor. How would you yourself like to have a nice bedroom to sleep in, all by yourself?" Quarter hour later, Dreamus was still swearing that he knew nothing whatever of any subversive activities on the part of Julian. Captain Cowlick said, rather testily, "Well, since you refuse to respond to our generosity, I must leave you with Ensign Stoit, I'm afraid. Be gentle with him, Ensign." "Yes, sir," said the ensign. The captain wearily trotted out of the room, and Stoit did indeed speak with gentleness, which was a surprise to Dreamus, because in the room were 2 of the guards to whom Stoit liked to show off. "Jessup, you're a man of intelligence. Now, no use trying to protect this boy Falk, because we've got enough on him to execute me anyway, so it won't be hurting him any if you give us a few more details about his treason, and you'll be doing yourself a good turn." Dreamus said nothing. "Going to talk?" Dreamus shook his head. "All right, then. To it!" "Bring in the guy that squealed on Jessup." Dreamus expected the guard to fetch Julian, but it was Julian's grandfather who wavered into the room. In the camp quadrangle, Dreamus had often seen him trying to preserve the dignity of his frock coat by rubbing at the spots with a wet rag. But in the cells there were no hooks for clothes and the priestly garment. Mr. Falk was a poor man, and it had not been very expensive at best, was grotesquely wrinkled now. He was blinking with sleepiness, and his silver hair was a hurrah's nest. Stoit, he was 30 or so, said cheerfully to the 2 elders, "Well now, you boys better stop being naughty and try to get some sense into your mildewy old brains, and then we can get some decent sleep. Why don't you 2 try to be honest, now that you've each confessed that the other was a traitor?" "What?" marveled Dreamus. "Sure, old Falk here says you carried his grandson's pieces to the Vermont Vigilance. Come on now. If you'll tell us who published that rag." "I've confessed nothing. I've nothing to confess," said Mr. Falk. Stoit screamed, "Will you shut up, you old hypocrite?" Stoit knocked him to the floor, and as Mr. Falk weaved dizzily on hands and knees, kicked him in the side with a heavy boot. The other 2 guards were holding back the sputtering Dreamus. Stoit jeered at Mr. Falk. "Well, you old bastard, you're on your knees, so let's hear you pray." "I shall." In agony, Mr. Falk raised his head, dust-smeared from the floor, straightened his shoulders, held up trembling hands, and with such sweetness in his voice as Dreamus had once heard in it when men were human, he cried, "Father, thou hast forgiven so long. Forgive them not, but curse them, for they know what they do." He tumbled forward, and Dreamus knew that he would never hear that voice again. In La Voix littéraire au Paris, the celebrated and genial professor of belles-lettres, Guillaume Semy, wrote with his accustomed sympathy, "I do not pretend to any knowledge of politics, and probably what I saw on my 4th journey to the States United this summer of 1938 was mostly on the surface and cannot be considered a profound analysis of the effects of corporism, but I assure you that I have never before seen that nation so great, our young and gigantic cousin in the West, in such bounding health and good spirits. I leave it to my economic confrères to explain such dull phenomenon as wage scales, and tell only what I saw, which is that the innumerable parades and vast athletic conferences of the Minutemen and the lads and lasses of the Corpo Youth Movement exhibited such rosy, contented faces, such undeviating enthusiasm for their hero, the Chief M. Windrip, that involuntarily I exclaimed, 'Here is a whole nation dipped in the river of youth.' Everywhere in the country was such feverish rebuilding of public edifices and apartment houses for the poor, as has never hitherto been known. In Washington, my old colleague, Monsieur le Secrétaire McGoblin, was so good as to cry, in that virile yet cultivated manner of his which is so well known, "Our enemies maintain that our labor camps are virtual slavery. Come, my old one, you shall see for yourself." He conducted me by one of the marvelously speedy American automobiles to such a camp near Washington, and having the workers assembled, he put to them frankly, "Are you low in heart?" As one man, they chorused, "No!" with a spirit like our own brave soldiers on the ramparts of Verdun. During the full hour he spent there, I was permitted to roam at will, asking such questions as I cared to, through the offices of the interpreter kindly furnished by His Excellency, Monsieur le Docteur Goblin, and every worker whom I thus approached assured me that never has he been so well fed, so tenderly treated, and so assisted to find an almost poetic interest in his chosen work as in this labor camp, this scientific cooperation for the well-being of all. With a certain temerity, I ventured to demand of Monsieur McGoblin what truth was there in the reports so shamefully criticized, especially, alas, in our beloved France, that in the concentration camps the opponents of corporalism are ill-fed and harshly treated. Monsieur McGoblin explained to me that there are no such things as concentration camps, if that term is to carry any penological significance. They are actually schools in which adults who have unfortunately been misled by the glib prophets of that milk and water religion, liberalism, are reconditioned to comprehend the new day of authoritative economic control. In such camps, he assured me, there are actually no guards, but only patient teachers and men who were once utterly uncomprehending of corporism and therefore opposed to it and are now daily going forth as the most enthusiastic disciples of the chief. Alas, that France and Great Britain should still be thrashing about in the slough of parliamentarism and so-called democracy, daily sinking deeper into debt and paralysis of industry because of the cowardice and traditionalism of our liberal leaders, feeble and outmoded men who were afraid to plump for either fascism or communism, who dare not or who are too power-hungry to cast off outmoded techniques like the Germans, Americans, Italians, Turks, and other really courageous peoples and place the sane and scientific control of all powerful totalitarian state in the hands of men of resolution. In October, John Polycop, arrested on suspicion of having just possibly helped a refugee to escape, arrived in the Trianon camp, and the first words between him and his friend Karl Pascal were no inquiries about health, but a derisive interchange, as though they were continuing a conversation broken only half an hour before. "Well, you old Bolshevik, I told you so. If you communists had joined with me and Norman Thomas to back Franklin Roosevelt, we wouldn't be here now. Rats! Why is Thomas and Roosevelt that started fascism, I ask you? Now shut up, John, and listen. What was the New Deal but pure fascism? What they had to do to the worker? Look here. No, wait, now listen." Dreamus felt at home again and comforted, though he did not also feel that Foolish probably had more constructive economic wisdom than John Polycop, Karl Pascal, Herbert Hooser, Buzz Windrip, Lee Saracen, and himself put together, or if not, Foolish had the sense to conceal his lack of wisdom by pretending that he could not speak English. Shad Ledoux, back in his hotel suite, reflected that he was getting a real dirty deal. He had been responsible for sending more traitors to concentration camps than had any other county commissioner in the province, yet he had not been promoted. It was late. He was just back from a dinner given by Francis Tasbro in honor of the provincial commissioner Swan and a board consisting of Judge Philip Jessup, Director of Education Owen J. Peasley, and Brigadier Kippersley, who were investigating the ability of Vermont to pay more taxes. Shad felt discontented. All those damn snobs trying to show off, talking at dinner about his bum show in New York, the first Corpo Review, Colin Stalin, written by Lee Saracen and Hector McGoblin. How those nuts had put on the agony about corpo art and drama freed from Jewish suggestiveness and the pure line of Anglo-Saxon sculpture, and even, by God, about corporate physics, simply trying to show off. And they had paid no attention to Shad when he had told his funny story about the stuck-up preacher in Fort Beulah, one Falk who had been so jealous because the MMs drilled on Sunday morning instead of going to his gospel shop that he had tried to get his grandson to make up lies about the MMs and whom Shad had amusingly arrested right on his own church. Not paid one bit of attention to him, even though he had carefully read all through the chief's 0 hour so he could quote it, and though he had been careful to be refined in his table manners and to stick out his little finger when he drank from a glass. He was lonely. The fellows he had once best known in poolroom and barbershop seemed frightened of him now, and the dirty snobs like Tajbro still ignored him. He was lonely for Sissy Jessup. Since her dad had been sent to Trianon, Shad didn't seem to be able to get her to come around to his rooms, even though he was the county commissioner and she was nothing now but the busted daughter of a criminal. And he was crazy about her. Why, he'd almost be willing to marry her if he couldn't get her any other way. But when he had hinted as much, or almost as much, she had just laughed at him, the dirty little snob. He had thought when he was a hired man that there was a lot more fun in being rich and famous. He didn't feel one bit different than he had then. Funny. End of chapter 31. It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, chapter 32. Dr. Lionel Adams, B.A. of Yale, Ph.D. of Chicago, Negro, had been a journalist, American consul in Africa, and at the time of Brasilius Winthrop's election, professor of anthropology in Howard University. As with all his colleagues, his professorship was taken over by a most worthy and needy white man, whose training in anthropology had been as a photographer on one expedition to Yucatan. In the dissension between the Booker Washington school of Negroes, who counseled patience in the new subjection of the Negroes to slavery, and the radicals who demanded that they join the communists in struggle for the economic freedom of all, white or black, Professor Adams took the mild Fabian former position. He went over the country preaching to his people that they must be realistic and make what future they could, not in some utopian fantasy, but on the inescapable basis of the ban against them. Near Burlington, Vermont, there is a small colony of Negroes, truck farmers, gardeners, houseworkers, mostly descended from slaves who, before the Civil War, escaped to Canada by the Underground Railway, conducted by such zealots as Truman Webb's grandfather, but who sufficiently loved the land of their forcible adoption to return to America after the war. From the colony had gone to the great cities young colored people who, before the corpo emancipation, had been nurses, doctors, merchants, officials. This colony Professor Adams addressed, bidding the young colored rebels to seek improvement within their own souls rather than in mere social superiority. As he was in person unknown to this Burlington colony, Captain Oscar Ledoux, nicknamed Shad, was summoned to censor the lecture. He sat hulked down in a chair at the back of the hall. Aside from addresses by MM officers and moral inspiration by his teachers in grammar school, it was the first lecture he had ever heard in his life, and he didn't think much of it. He was irritated that this stuck-up nigger didn't spiel like the characters of Octavius Roy Cohen, one of Shad's favorite authors, but had the nerve to try to sling English just as good as Shad himself. It was more irritating that the loudmouth pup should look so much like a bronze statue, and finally, it was simply more than a guy could stand that the big bum should be wearing a tuxedo. So when Adams, as he called himself, claimed that there were good poets and teachers and even doctors and engineers among the niggers, which was plainly an effort to incite folks to rebellion against the government, Shad signaled his squad and arrested Adams in the midst of his lecture, addressing him, "You goddamn dirty, ignorant, stinking nigger! I'm gonna shut your big mouth for you for keeps!" Dr. Adams was taken to the Trianon concentration camp. Ensign Stoit thought it would be a good joke on those fresh beggars, almost communist, you might say, Jessup and Pascal, to lodge the nigger right in the same cell with them. But they actually seemed to like Adams, talked to him as though he were white and educated. So Stoit placed him in a solitary cell, where he could think over his crime and having bitten the hand that fed him. The greatest single shock that ever came to the Trianon camp was in November 1938, when there appeared among them as the newest prisoner, Shad Ledoux. It was he who was responsible for nearly half of them being there. The prisoners whispered that he had been arrested on charges by Francis Tasbro, officially for having grafted on shopkeepers, unofficially for having failed to share enough of the graft with Tasbro. But such cloudy causes were less discussed than the question of how they would murder Shad now that they had him safe. All Minutemen who were under discipline, except only such Reds as Julian Fout, were privileged prisoners in the concentration camps. They were safeguarded against the common, i.e. criminal, i.e. political inmates, and most of them, once reformed, were returned to the MM ranks with a greatly improved knowledge of how to flog malcontents. Shad was housed by himself in a single cell, like a not-too-bad hall bedroom, and every evening he was permitted to spend 2 hours in the officers' mess room. The scum could not get at him, because his exercise hour was at a different time from theirs. During this begged the plotters against Shad to restrain themselves. "Good Lord, Doremus, do you mean that after the sure enough battles we've gone through, you're still a bourgeois pacifist and you still believe in the sanctity of a lump of hog meat like Ledoux?" demanded Karl Pascal. "Well, yes, I do, a little. I know Shad came from a family of 12 underfed brats up on Mount Terror. Not much chance, but more important than that, I don't believe in individual assassination as an effective means of fighting despotism. The blood of the tyrants is the seed of the massacre, and are you taking cue from me and quoting sound doctrine when it's time for a little liquidation?" said Karl. "This one tyrant's going to lose a lot of blood." The Pascal, whom Doremus had considered as, at his most violent, only a gas bag, looked at him with a stare in which all friendliness was frozen. Karl demanded of his cellmates, a different set now than at Doremus's arrival. "Shall we get rid of this typhus germ, Ledoux?" John Pollicott, Truman Webb, the surgeon, the carpenter, each of them nodded slowly, without feeling. At exercise hour, the discipline of men marching out to the quadrangle was broken when one prisoner stumbled with a cry, knocked over another man, and loudly apologized just at the barred entrance of Shad Ledoux's cell. The accident made a knot collect before the cell. Doremus, on the edge of it, saw Shad looking out, his wide face blank with fear. Someone somehow had lighted and thrown in Shad's cell a large wad of waste soaked with gasoline. It caught the thin wall board which divided Shad's cell from the next. The whole room looked presently like the firebox of a furnace. Shad was screaming as he beat at his sleeves, his shoulders. Doremus remembered the scream of a horse clawed by wolves in the far north. When they got Shad out, he was dead. He had no face at all. Captain Cowlick was deposed as superintendent of the camp and vanished to the insignificance whence he had come. He was succeeded by Shad's friend, the belligerent snake Tizra, now a battalion leader. His first executive act was to have all the 200 inmates drawn up in the quadrangle and to announce, "I'm not going to tell you guys anything about how I'm going to feed or sleep you till I finish putting the fear of God into every one of you murderers." There were offers of complete pardon for anyone who would betray the man who had thrown the burning waste into Shad's cell. It was followed by enthusiastic private offers from the prisoners that anyone who did thus tattle would not live to get out. So, as Doremus had guessed, they all suffered more than Shad's death had been worth, and to him, thinking of Sissy, thinking of Shad's testimony at Hanover, it had been worth a great deal. It had been very precious and lovely. A court of special inquiry was convened, with Provincial Commissioner Effingham Swan himself presiding. He was very busy with all bad works. He used airplanes to be about them. 10 prisoners, one out of every 20 in the camp, were chosen by lot and shot summarily. Among them was Professor Victor Loveland, who, for all his rags and scars, was neatly academic to the last, with his eyeglasses and his slick towel-colored hair parted in the middle as he looked at the firing squad. Suspects like Julian Falk were beaten more often, kept longer in those cells in which one could not stand, sit, nor lie. Then, for 2 weeks in December, all visitors and all letters were forbidden, and newly arrived prisoners were shut off by themselves, and the cellmates, like boys in a dormitory, would sit up till midnight in whispered discussion as to whether this was more vengeance by Snake Tisra, or whether something was happening in the world outside that was too disturbing for the prisoners to know. End of chapter 32.